A raccoon on Butler campus.
Okay, so this is interesting, and I don't know if it's quite true or not, but there was a report 2 days ago that a lady was walking on campus and that a raccoon snatched her purse. And I'm not making this up. I can send you this. And that the raccoon took the purse down into the drain, and that the police had to come and retrieve it at the golf club.
Sam, that is not an acceptable fundraising strategy. I just want to advise you right there.
We do whatever we can to raise money, especially in these times. So
I've got a raccoon that I could ship your way.
you know, we'll take them. We need some staff here.
Let's build a boys, right?
Mm-hmm. There. Okay. Maybe that's better.
Is that Trina?
That's
I see Marge, but no Mary.
Trina said.
There they are.
There they are.
Yeah.
We're social distancing. I'm behind her.
Yeah.
Hey, John found an open barber in Carmel for all you guys.
Oh, that's good news. I need that.
Yeah. Don't waste your money, Rush.
Rush, you're getting a little shaggy back there. You need to kind of work on the back.
And he's doing a good job. About 2 steps with the scissors and it's done.
Yeah.
Mary, can you email me?
Yeah,
Mary, can you email me the location?
sure.
Okay.
I'll get it from John.
Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I want to be respectful of our guest speaker's time here today. So it is, it's great to see you all and to have everybody. We've gotten really good attendance to date. And again, it's a nice way to connect. I think this is maybe the 6th or 7th Zoom meeting that we've done. So again, really appreciate seeing you today. A couple of announcements before I turn it over to our guest speaker. Again, if you could stay on mute until the question and answer part, we would appreciate that. A few reminders. Again, I think everybody's aware that the International Convention has been canceled and that we've also postponed member dues until October 1st. We do hope all in-person meetings are going to resume in July. Certainly hope so. And then we've had to also cancel our golf outing for the year. I'm excited. We've got a couple. I know today our speaker will be fantastic, and then we've got a couple of really great speakers coming up. We have the Grand Poobah of Kiwanis next Thursday. Peter Mancuso is the International Vice President of the entire worldwide Kiwanis organization. He's going to join us, and I think he'll share some interesting insights into how the organization is faring right now. And then I think a special treat, a good friend of mine, her name is Joanne Scott. She runs the NCAA men's basketball tournament, is going to join us in June to talk about June 11th to talk about the decision-making process around canceling the NCAA tournament this year. And lest I not skip, David Young and Mike Halstead are going to do a presentation on architecture and historic preservation on the 28th. So be sure to tune in to that one as well. Before I turn it over to the Jim, are there any guests that are here that might introduce themselves?
DLG Gerslin, Kiwanis Club of New Kingston from Jamaica. And there are other members online with us. Greetings, everyone.
Greetings.
Hi, Riemann.
Hello,
Distinguished President, Secretary Sandra Davis from the Kiwanis Club of New Kingston in Jamaica.
That's outstanding. We're really enjoying the Jamaica presence on the calls, and like I said, we're going to look for one of the fellow Kiwanians to sponsor a club-wide trip down to Jamaica to meet in person, perhaps this fall.
This is
I'm
Jack
looking at-
McGinnis from Atlanta. I'm joining to hear the servant leadership speaker.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, Jack. I threw the link out to my servant leadership board, and so we appreciate having you as well. Any other guests?
Hi, Director Judith from the Kiwanis Club of New Kingston in Jamaica.
Outstanding.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, if there are not any other guests, I'm going to
Hello, Keisha Ann Down, Kiwanis Club of New Kingston, Jamaica, joining as well.
Okay. I think we've got a Jamaican quorum.
Good morning. This is Janet Lawrence, Kiwanian.
Well,
Good morning. This is Sonia Liebert from the Kiwanis Club of New Kingston, Jamaica.
Outstanding. Okay, is that everyone?
No, good morning. This is Cynthia Taylor from the Kiwanis Club of Friends Across Borders in Jamaica.
And
Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce our guest speaker, and I am really appreciative of his time. We serve on the Robert Greenleaf Servant Leadership Board, which is based out of Newark, New Jersey, or should I say South Orange, New Jersey. It's on the Seton Hall campus, and we serve together, although we have not met in person yet. I was asked to join the board last fall, and so we had to cancel our in-person meeting in April. But I'm thrilled to introduce Jim Lemoine. A little bit about Jim. He's an assistant professor of organization and human resources and a researcher with the Center for Leadership and Organizational Effectiveness at the University of Buffalo. His research focuses on leadership, ethics, and creativity. He's been published in the Harvard Business Review and Business Horizons, as well as the Academy of Management Annals and the Journal of Applied Psychology. His work frequently appears in magazines such as Forbes, Fast Company, and Entrepreneur. Like I mentioned, he serves on the Greenleaf Servant Leadership Board. And prior to obtaining his PhD at Georgia Tech, he was an entrepreneur, consultant, and manager at AT&T. And he has his undergraduate degree, I believe, from the national football champion LSU Tigers. So without further ado, we're going to have Jim speak, and then we'll take questions following his talk. So thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Graham. Can everybody hear me? Volume's coming through. I see nods. Okay, I am having trouble. I had a presentation, and I was trying to screen share, and I don't think it worked because I think you see like the PowerPoint, but I'll try to go through it anyway in the interest of time. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for having me, especially with such a global contingent. And I got to say, William Murphy, if that is in fact your real name, that is the most realistic virtual background I've ever seen. It almost looks like you're actually in Florida. Yeah, I can't believe that. Here in Buffalo, it is cloudy and gray, and it snowed a few days ago. So that is really nice to see. I'm coming to you from my office at the State University of New York, where I am officially deemed an essential employee because I have to use my facilities to record videos for class. One thing before I jump in, please forgive me for looking like a refugee from the 1970s or 80s, although those were fine decades. I have not been able to find a barber that's open in Buffalo, so I am trying, I'm going for a Monkees or a Beatles look lately. So talking to you today about servant leadership, and I think the best way to really talk about servant leadership is to tell stories. So I'm going to tell you stories about 3 men and a woman, 3 men and a woman, basically. And it's not going to be as cool as it would if I could go through the PowerPoint the way I'm supposed to. But again, let me just try really quick if it'll let me switch screens. Nope. Okay, I think we're just going to go with this. All right. So how I got into this was really one thing that jumped out at me. I'm an organizational psychologist, which basically means when my family asked, when my grandma asked, oh, what's an organizational psychologist? I said, you know how you've hated every boss you've ever had, And people say, yeah. And I say, well, I try to figure out why and make them stop. So it's the psychology of work. It's the psychology of motivation, leadership. Why are some people more motivated than others? Why are some people happier than others? And what is this leadership thing? And what makes some people better at it than others? And one thing that I love to ask whenever I do consulting or give a speech or even with a class, EMBA undergrad, I love asking, well, what is leadership? Because it doesn't matter if it's like a leadership class or a group of senior executives. I get crickets. Like everybody's very quiet and they look away really quick, so I won't make eye contact with them and they'll have to take a guess at it, right? If I force them to write something down, 20 people, I get 20 different answers. So I've been really, really interested in this for a long time. And I really believe that this whole idea of servant leadership provides a really neat answer. Let me see if I can at least do this so I'm not giving too much away in advance. There we go. On your screen, hopefully you can see a picture of a man with a stellar mustache. When I show this to I've actually shown this, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but here at SUNY, I've shown this picture to a group of MBA students and asked them if they could tell me who it was, and waited for several minutes for them to figure it out until one of them finally said, oh, dude, I got this. That is Joshua L. Chamberlain, and from 1828 to 1914, he worked at the Library of Congress. Close, not exactly. That was his lifespan. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was a professor like me. He was an academic. He was so moved by the Union's cause during the United States Civil War that he volunteered. He went to officers' school, quickly worked himself up the chain of command until he actually commanded a very pivotal place. And I'm going to tie this back to leadership and servant leadership. Just bear with me. But for a second, I want you to imagine that you were Joshua L. Chamberlain. I want you to imagine that glorious mustache was flowing down your face, right? And take a look at this. It's July 2nd, 1863, the eve of the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, if you know anything about U.S. geography, Gettysburg's in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania's in the north. Think about this. The Civil War is between the north and the south. If we're fighting this far north, the Union's doing pretty rough. This is the moment more than any other. It looks like the Union's going to lose. The Confederates, the bad guys, are going to win, right? Chamberlain commanded the 20th Maine, which started out with 1,600 men, is down to about 250, 300 because war is hell, right? It's considered the weak link of the Union Army. He is assigned to defend a post of vital importance to the Union called Little Round Top. Maybe you've heard of it. And he tells his commanding officers, look, I just don't have enough men for this. There's no way my 266 men can handle this. The Union generals say, well, we don't have any more men for you. You're going to have to make do with what you've got. Chamberlain says, you don't understand. It is impossible. We can't possibly do it. They say, we don't have any. Chamberlain asks a third time, I've got to have more men. They say, fine. Here's 120 mutineers from the 2nd Maine. And fascinating story. You'd imagine that government could never make a mistake this bad in modern era. Of course, back at the time, most of these soldiers couldn't read, right? So they believed that they had signed 2 years ago, 2-year contracts for military service. Because they couldn't read, they didn't know that there was a bureaucratic mix-up, and instead of signing 2-year contracts, they accidentally signed 3-year contracts. So, and they had no clue. So now think about it this way. The 2 years have passed. These 120 men thinking they're going back to their friends, their family, their farms. They've got men with guns telling them they have to stay because you signed a 3-year contract. Can't imagine government making a mistake like that nowadays, but you can hopefully understand why those 120 men were so distraught. Joshua Chamberlain says to his commanding officers, what am I going to do with 120 mutineers? And they say, well, you've got the right to shoot them if they disobey you. So Chamberlain is given a speech that night. He needs those men on his side the next day. And I just want you to think of everything you know from your life experience, from your business experience, from your Kiwanis experience, everything you know about leadership. If you were in that situation where really the fate of the free world depends on you motivating these 120 men who have been wronged to fight with you, what would you say? What, just based on everything you know, what would be the main point, the big thesis statement, I guess, that you would try to go with. I did this speech, actually a speech on servant leadership at a toy company, and there was a lady in the back of the room who stood up, and she was one of those ladies. She was dressed in pink from head to toe and had a pink hat, and she stood up and said, well, I would just shoot one of them first just to get everyone's attention before I started talking. I'm like, wow, you work for a toy company. That explains what's going on with my kids. Thank you. So when I tell this story to my students and I ask them to think about the speech, they say, I actually once a year, someone says, you're going to pull up a YouTube clip of that speech now, aren't you? And they are shocked when I tell them that there are no YouTube clips available. of this speech from 1863. And one of them always says, "Are you sure?" Like, I'm pretty good at searching YouTube. No, we don't have it. What we do have are diaries, we have journals, we have newspaper article, you know, we've got things like that. Historians have managed to piece together, I mean, this is a true story, what Josh Chamberlain actually said to his men that night. And apparently it was a pretty short speech. I'm going to read what I've got. This probably isn't the exact speech, but there's enough in common between all the different diaries and letters that this is probably the gist of it. Here's what Josh Chamberlain said. He said, "I've been told that if you don't come with me and serve in this Union Army, I can shoot you. But you know I won't do that, not to good Maine men. We're down below half strength, the Confederates are coming, and we need you, no doubt about that. So many of us have come and served and died, and we did it because it was the right thing to do. We're an army going out to set other men free, and what we're fighting for in the end is for each other. We don't know the future, we can't plan for it much, but the cause for which we fight is higher. Our thought is greater. That thought is our power. And this is my thought. I think if we lose this fight, the war will be over. We'll lose the whole damn war. But if you choose to come with us, I'll be personally grateful." Now, I don't know what your reaction is to that, but it's not what you'd expect, right? I mean, right off the bat, this guy who has immense power over these 120 men, he can kill them. This guy, he's giving it up right off the bat. And he's just asking them, "Can you come with me?" But against all odds, all 120 men signed up to fight the next day. And if you know your military history, your Civil War history, maybe you know what comes next. These men are doing fantastic defending this point until they run out of ammunition. Click, 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 click. And the Confederates can tell that they're running out of ammunition, so they kind of lower their weapons a little bit, get cocky, start walking up the hill. The last thing they're expecting is for someone in Josh Chamberlain's unit to call for the bayonet charge. You know, if I was being set upon by angry Confederate hordes and I was out of bullets, you know, I would probably run away. That's not what these men did. History doesn't know if it was Josh Chamberlain who called for the charge or one of the senior officers, but it so surprised the Confederates that it broke their ranks, allowing this unit to flank another Confederate unit, which freed up another Union unit to flank a different one, basically turned the tide of the battle. The battle turned the tide of the Civil War. You could argue that the country we have today in the United States of America, it actually exists because of that speech Joshua Chamberlain gave that night and the fact that these men were brave in the face of this adversity. So what am I trying to, I love this story. I don't think this story is told enough. Think back to that speech I gave you. Josh Chamberlain, as the leader in perhaps the country's most pivotal moment, he could have coerced them. He chose not to. I mean, think about when you've been a manager or when you've been managed. What's the most power you have over someone? You could fire them. What's the worst thing you could do to them? I mean, maybe if you're Steve Jobs, you could try to blackball somebody. You could give someone a bad shift. You could not give them a promotion. You could not give them a raise. And we use that power all the time as business leaders, as organizational leaders. You can make people look bad because that's the easy thing to do, right? And we see our governmental leaders do things like this all the time. Josh Chamberlain had a greater power than any of that. He could kill these guys in order to get them to do what he wanted them to do, but he gave that power up right away because he said, "I don't want you to fight for that reason. I want you to fight for me because you want to." He didn't coerce them. Even though he could have, he chose to persuade them. He persuaded the men that the cause was noble and worth doing. And here's something I like to mention from the research, and I've spent the last 10 years researching this. I'm a leadership researcher. Did you know that one of the most motivating things for employees and organizations, no matter what you do, is if you talk about how it makes other people's lives better, if it benefits, even if people say they don't care about morality and other people, it actually is a subconscious motivator for people. So I like to ask businesses, is your cause noble and worth doing? And sometimes I get great answers. I was doing a speech at a United Way event where there were lots of different businesses in the audience, and someone from a bank stood up. And he said, "You know, honestly, probably not. You know, we do investments, we do savings accounts, we do mortgages. Our goal is to make more money for people. You know, we're a business, we're after profit. So I really like what you're saying, but it doesn't really fit with us as a bank." And then 5 minutes later, someone from a different bank stood up. Keep in mind, these two banks offer exactly the same services. And he said, "Well, of course what we do is noble and worth doing. We help people afford their dreams. We help people retire in safety. We help people buy their first house. We help people send their kids to college. What could be more noble than that?" And again, both banks did the same thing, but they were looking at it in very different ways. Josh Chamberlain persuaded them they had a better future if they came together for a goal. He respected them and tried to help them, but also told them, hey, I'm going to help you. I need you to help others. We're an army going out to end slavery. We're an army going out to set other men free. In the country's most critical moment, instead of coercing, this was the path he took. And in so doing, turned the tide of a war, changed the course of a nation. And that to me is servant leadership. That's a lot of the stuff that the founder of servant leadership, who I'll talk about in a second, was talking about how servant leaders don't coerce. They persuade. They want people to do things not because they have to, but because they want to. In fact, I'll tell you, I collect definitions of leadership. And my favorite definition of leadership actually comes from this guy, a second military example. But usually I have to explain to my students who this is. This is former President and General Dwight Eisenhower. Actually, I don't know if you can you still, I don't know if you can still see me, but I'm going to hold something up just in case you can't. I'm such a big fan of this guy. This is, well, actually, I'll tell the story first. So you guys probably know him best as a former president, as a general. What a lot of people don't know about Eisenhower was that he credited a lot of his best ideas in World War II for beating the Nazis to his men. Because one thing, oh, okay, we'll get to it. Because one thing he'd do a lot was, you know, in the Army at the time, they had the mess tent and they had the officers tent, right? Where the rank and file, the enlisted men, the draftees went to eat, and then where the officers went. And Eisenhower wouldn't eat in the officers tent. Even though he was the seniorest of senior officers, he'd go to the enlisted men's tent. He would sit down next to someone he didn't know. And apparently he had a great line. He'd say, hey, soldier, how's the war going for you? And, you know, at first they were a little scared of him and intimidated. He'd try to get them to open up. He'd ask them some questions about their family. But then he'd ask, soldier, I know when you're in the front lines, when you're down in the trenches, you see things that I don't. And you probably say, boy, if high command just knew this or high command knew that, they'd do things differently. They ought to do this. Well, soldier, I'm high command, and I want to hear what I'm missing. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me what I need to do. And he would honestly listen, and he wouldn't let him just suck up and go, oh, General, you're doing great. No, tell me what we could do better, and he'd take those ideas back to high command. There's a reason that he is widely recognized by historians as one of the last truly bipartisan presidents of the United States of America. He was a Republican who worked for the Democratic Congress, got a lot of stuff built. The first one to build the massive interstate highway system. That's why it's called the Eisenhower Interstate System. In fact, this was why I did it. One of the prides of my collection, this is actually, I don't know if you can see this, this is a framed letter. It's a White House letter dated from, what was it, 1959, I believe, yes, in which Dwight Eisenhower was, President Eisenhower was ordering his cabinet to actually form a new textiles committee on the advice of some Democratic congressmen who he thought just had a really good idea. I don't think the picture is showing up. Oh, did you see? I don't know. Are we, give me a thumbs up or something if everything's okay. We're good? Anybody? No thumbs up? I got one. Okay, very good. So anyway, if I could go back to my share screen real quick. Here we go. With this in mind, I want to share with you Dwight Eisenhower's definition of leadership, and that's this. Leadership is getting people to do what you want them to do because they want to do it. And think about what's entailed in that. Not because they have to do it. Not because they're forced to do it. Not because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't do it. Not because someone told them to. Not because they feel like they have to do it. Not because they could lose their job. Not because they want a raise. Not because they want a promotion. Not because they don't want a pay cut. Not because they want the best shift. Not because they're scared. Not because they feel they have to. Because they genuinely see this as something worth doing. Or they genuinely see this as, well, I can see my future, I can see other people's future, I can see why I would want to do this. And that definition of leadership, our research shows, is one of the most effective ways to lead people, and that ties back into servant leadership. Story number 3. This is a picture of a guy named Robert Greenleaf, never in the military. We're gonna get away from military for a second. He was a mathematics major at Carleton College in Minnesota back in the 1920s, looking forward to a career as an engineer. And he had a class, it was one of his required general ed classes. He wasn't looking forward to it, so he saved it until his very last semester. It was an economics and sociology class with a professor named Oscar Helming. And Professor Oscar Helming, although the term hadn't really come around in the 1920s, 40 years later, he was the kind of person who might be called a hippie. He talked a lot about how we needed a more kind and just world, and big business wasn't always serving us well. In fact, there was one speech Oscar Helming gave that meant so much to Greenleaf, he actually recorded it verbatim in his notebook. It went like this: we're becoming a nation of large institutions. Everything's getting big. Governments, churches, businesses, labor unions, universities, and none of these big institutions are serving well, either the people whom they're set up to serve or the people who staff them to render the service. Now, those institutions can be bludgeoned, coerced, threatened from the outside, but they can only be changed from the inside by somebody who knows how to do it and who wants to do it. Some of you folks ought to make your careers inside these institutions and become the ones who respond to the idea that they could do better. Imagine if in our homes, schools, and churches, a new generation of people were trained to appreciate the values attainable in a civilized country, public opinion would cease to estimate men by their possessions and learn to estimate them by their qualities as persons. Hopefully you can see how that ties into the Eisenhower definition, right? So young Bob Greenleaf, who wants to get his degree in math, he's so inspired by this. He's like, I don't want to be an engineer anymore. I want to go out and work in institutions. I want to make a big difference. In fact, he says, I'm going to do my research and I'm going to find the one organization in the whole country that employs more people than any other, so I can work there, so I can make the biggest difference on people. So he did his research and he figured out what was the one institution in the United States of America in the 1920s hired more people than anybody else. That institution is still around today. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think through who you think it is. Usually I have people guess, and usually people are wrong. If I'm in class, they say, Google, Apple. No, they were not the biggest employers in the 1920s. The biggest employer actually was the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which today, of course, we would know of as AT&T, and this was before the Bell breakups and everything like that. So he goes to the AT&T recruiting office with his mathematics degree, because remember, it was his last semester, so he didn't have time to change it to management or psychology or sociology or anything like that. He slaps his resume down, says, I want to work with people. The AT&T manager kind of looks at it and says, you're a math major, why are you here? He says, I want to work with people. They say, the only opening we have is for someone to dig telephone pole holes. Basically, you know, the holes, you know, back-breaking manual labor, actually digging the holes to put the telephone poles in. Bob Greenleaf wants to work with this company with his college degree, says, I'll take it. His girlfriend was not happy with this decision. So for 6 months, he's working out in the hot sun, digging telephone poles. He gets noticed. He gets promoted. He becomes the foreman. He gets noticed doing that. Within 3 years, basically long story short, he becomes AT&T's first director of management development. He is basically one of the first leadership trainers in the United States of America, in the world. And he has a really unique way of going about what he does. He will give a class, let's say that on this call, this group is the 1936 a class of new AT&T managers. He will train you for 6 weeks on what leadership is, what it is, and what you do, what you don't do, how to do it, what works, what doesn't. But then for the next 4 months, what he doesn't just move to the next group of students, he follows you around. He follows you, he watches what you say, he watches what you do, and more importantly, he watches how people react to you. He watches what works and what doesn't. He's got this little notebook and he's always taking notes. Okay, that worked, that didn't. I told them to do that, but that was a really bad idea. Scratch that. They should do this instead. So 6 months later, he's doing the next year's class of AT&T managers, and he's got this revised training. Do this, do this, do this, don't do this, don't do this. And then he follows them for 4 months, and he revises his notes, and he scratches out things on his notebooks, and he revises it. He does this. So you see what he's doing? He's always trying to figure out, what did I get wrong? Where did I get this wrong? What am I doing? He repeats this process, ladies and gentlemen, for 36 years. That's his life's work, again and again and again. Training managers, watching what works, watching what doesn't. He started out with one notebook. You know, by the end of the year, he had a whole shelf full of notebooks. He had a storage unit full of notebooks by the time he retired. When people call me like a leadership expert, I always laugh and say, no, I'm absolutely not a leadership expert. This guy did it for decades and decades. Now, by 1970, when he's retired, this guy's known worldwide as someone who's forgotten more about leadership than most people will ever know. And he announces, you know, I'm gonna write a book. I'm gonna release an essay, just summing everything. And the world is really hot for this. Wow, Bob Greenleaf, the legendary AT&T leadership expert, is finally gonna share what he thinks. He's gonna tell us what he knows. So the world is a little confused when they see that the title of the first part of the book, the first essay he writes, is called The Servant as Leader. And the world is confused when it doesn't talk about economic theory or Milton Friedman's profit-centered leadership. Instead, it's got a really strange message. Robert Greenleaf says, you know what? Leadership is most effective when it doesn't focus the most on goals and instead focuses the most on people. He says businesses are most effective when they focus a little bit less. They don't stop focusing on profit, but they also focus on customers and even on stakeholders, broadly communities, making society a better place. He talks about how the most successful managers he ever met at AT&T actually put their employees' goals before their own. They were forgiving and developmental when employees made mistakes, but they could be harsh when people needed to be developed. He talked about how they didn't hoard power, but they shared it. He talked about, and one of the big things he said was that the most effective managers at AT&T, they admitted, and this is really relevant right now in COVID, I think, they didn't pretend to have all the answers. They didn't feel like they had to be the smartest person in the room, sitting at the head of the table. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying they said, I've got no clue, I've got no plan. They said, I'm not sure. Why don't we find the answer together? And in fact, that's why Bob Greenleaf was a very big fan of the fourth person, Mother Teresa, and a very big fan of this quote: I can do things you cannot. You can do things I cannot. Together we can do great things. I think in the 1960s and the 1970s, even now, we've kind of accepted this myth that leaders have to be on top of everything. They always have to know all the answers. They've always got to have a very specific plan. I mean, these things are good when they're possible, but of course, in times like this, and in times like the 1970s, that's really difficult to do. I think social media plays a role in this. We all feel like we have to have an opinion. We have to be on one side or the other. We have to either click the like button or we have to click the angry button. But that's not the way rational thought works. Rational thought realizes, hey, we need to figure this out. We need to figure this out together. And rational thought realizes, I may not have all the knowledge I need for that. Maybe someone on my team, even though they're ranked below me, knows more about certain things than I do. That's a hard thing for a lot of managers to get through their heads. And I said managers, not leaders there, right? The fact that maybe there are people around you who are smarter than you in certain areas. Maybe you need a little bit of humility sometimes. And maybe you need to direct businesses in unique ways. This is how I define servant leadership based on all this. This is what I've been using in my writing, in my books, magazine articles, stuff like that. It's humbly influencing and developing others towards continuous and meaningful improvement for all stakeholders. A couple of key elements there. One, you're humble. You realize you don't have all the answers, but you're working together with all your team to leverage everybody's strengths to get them out. You're influencing them. You're developing them. You're trying to make them better. One of the best servant leadership companies I know, it's a little home health company here in Buffalo called Allwell. They actually have an Allwell University. Now, a lot of their employees, they're not really well educated. They're a lot of high school dropouts, GEDs. In their Allwell U, they have classes like how to balance a budget, how to keep a checking account, how to find a babysitter, things that have nothing to do with work, but just help their employees to be more successful all around in life. Since they started doing that, their turnover has dropped dramatically and they've actually become a lot more profitable. And then towards continuous and meaningful improvement for all stakeholders. Here's what this means. It doesn't mean you stop focusing on profit or mission accomplishment if you're a nonprofit. It just means that's one thing of many. Research finds that 2/3 of big businesses and organizations in the world have what's called a stockholder model, where really everything they do is just focused on making as much money as possible, darn the consequences, while 1/3 have something more like this, where yes, profit is important, but we're also taking care of employees, communities, customers, trying to do the right thing, environment, diversity. Research shows again and again, peer-reviewed, replicated studies, my own work as well as others, that actually companies that ascribe to this model, where profit is just one thing you focus on among many, actually make more profit than the businesses that only focus on profit. I call it the paradox of leadership, and I'll say it one more time because I know that's confusing. The most profitable businesses are the ones who focus actually a little less on profit and a little bit more on people, on customers, on employees and communities. And really quick, I know I'm just about over time now. These are the 7 skills that research has shown. These are what a servant leader does. Servant leaders help others to grow and succeed. They act with empathy, building personal relationships. They're not pushovers, don't get me wrong. Someone who just says yes to everything that they ask for, they're not a leader, they're a doormat. But they try to understand where people are coming from. They empathize. They empower their teammates. As I said, they share power rather than hoarding it. They demonstrate conceptual skills, meaning that they know what's going on. They're one of the first people to know if something goes wrong. They're behaving ethically, fairly, honestly. They're putting others first. And then the big one that really separates servant leadership from any other kind of leadership that I'm sure you guys would appreciate being in Kiwanis, they engage in external citizenship. They talk about, here's how what we do helps the community. Here's how what we do helps our customers have better lives. They're always reminding their employees of that, because even in nonprofits, employees can tend to forget. So Graham, I apologize. I know I'm over time, but you get me started on this, I will talk your ear off. In case anybody's in, well, let me put the last one up here. That's my email address, jlemoine@buffalo.edu. I'm a servant leadership research. This is what I do for a living. This is what I write about for a living. If you're connected with an organization that would like to be a part of some research on servant leadership, we are always looking for partners. How can I, here we go. And I want to show you this. If what I said to you makes any sense at all, I'm not trying to push my own book here. I'm not doing that. This is Greenleaf's book, Servant Leadership, A Journey into the Nature of Legitimate Power and Greatness. This is a collection of his first essays. It's dense, it's heavy, it's philosophical. If what I said appeals to you at all, it's an absolutely, absolutely amazing read. And then I'll show you this one from the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, where both Graham and I serve. Inspiration for Servant Leaders. It was just published. I wrote a couple of chapters for it, kind of outlining some of the stuff I just told you. I get no money from it. It all goes to the center, which is a not-for-profit, a good cause. But if you guys are interested in any of those stuff, those are some books you might be interested in. So thank you for your attention. Are we doing Q&A? Oh, happy to share the slides. Yes, I just saw that in the chat. Happy to do Q&A. How does this work? Graham, Taylor?
Yeah, we will. We'll take questions. I want to thank you. I could have listened for another hour. I thought that was fantastic.
Oh, I can talk for another hour.
We'll open it up to questions. One thing I might add is Robert Greenleaf is a native Hoosier. He was born and raised in Terre Haute.
Yes, I'm sorry. I meant to. In fact, until about 10 years ago, the center was based in Indiana, Indianapolis. No accounting for tastes. I don't know why they moved. Obviously, they should still be there. But yeah, we were there for a long time.
Absolutely. So let's open it up for questions.
I think I put him to sleep.
I'm going to start, and I'll let you think of some more questions. One of the questions I have, Jim, is, when I think about two of the great business leaders in the last couple of decades, Steve Jobs and Jeff Bezos, and neither one I would characterize as a servant leader. So I'd ask how you kind of rationalize that with your philosophy. And then secondly, can you give some maybe, well-known examples of servant leadership? I actually think Jobs' successor, Tim Cook, is a servant leader. So I'll throw those two questions out for you.
Yeah, so on the first one, and this is subjective, right? This is just my opinion. I do not look at Steve Jobs as a great leader. I look at him as a fantastic manager. I look at him as a great business director, a great innovator. But how do you define leadership? I mean, you saw how I define it. Leadership is getting people to do what you want done because they want to do it. If you read Steve Jobs' bio, if you look at the things he wrote, if you look at his company policies, he ruled by fear. He ruled by the force of his great ideas. Did he really motivate people beyond their belief that I can be rich if I stay here? No, people were miserable there. I mean, you see a lot of this. He did not treat people well. So I've always taken issue with the idea of Steve Jobs as a great leader. Great business manager? Absolutely. Entrepreneur, innovator, without a doubt. Steve Jobs is actually, I talk about him with my undergrads a lot. He's kind of a dangerous example. You can get away with being like that if you're that brilliant, if you're that much of an innovator. Most of us aren't. I'm not. Most of my students aren't. Maybe some of you are. I don't know. But he succeeded. Apple succeeded in spite of his leadership style, in my opinion, rather than because of it. Apple succeeded because he was just such a groundbreaking master of creativity and innovation. But that's just my opinion. So I don't look at, we actually did a big review a couple of years ago. We found that there's 69 different styles of leadership out there that different people ascribe to. Steve Jobs, you might call him a goal-focused one, a charismatic one. You might call him an abusive one. But a servant leader, absolutely not. As far as examples, they're hard to come by. It's really, really rare, right? I mean, examples we talk about in the center a lot are folks like, the ones you'd expect, your Lincolns, your Martin Luther Kings, your Mother Teresa's, Nelson Mandela. There's a big one that we talk about a lot. In business, it's hard to say because, you know, how much of it is reality versus hype? You know, how much of it is just people putting themselves up as someone like this, but not matching the words to it. Now, I will say that on August 19th of 2019, maybe some of you heard of this, the Business Roundtable, which is a group of about 500 of the CEOs of the biggest companies in the world, they released a statement saying that the purpose of a corporation could no longer be only to make money, but it also had to include in it a focus on helping employees, helping customers, fairly dealing with vendors, making the world a better place while making money. So it was basically this whole stakeholder servant leadership thing right there. This drive was really led by companies like Starbucks. I'll tell you, Howard Behar, who I know, who was the founder of Starbucks, who was instrumental in the beginning of the Greenleaf Center. And I would certainly call him a servant leader. Herb Keller from Southwest, going back 20 years, but you know, one of the most successful business people of the 20th century. Roberto Goizueta, the former CEO of the Coca-Cola Company, is another example that comes to mind. But there's a difference for me between I ran a successful, profitable company, and I'm someone who really inspired and motivated my employees the way a servant leader does, which is a long and rambling answer, but hopefully I stalled long enough for people to come up with more questions so this doesn't get awkward. Should I look at the chat?
Yeah, we've got another question on the chat here.
I see someone asked, are the books online? Yeah, greenleaf.org. Both of those books are offered through the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership. So you can go to greenleaf.org and you'll find them both there, or they're both on Amazon too. I like to push the Greenleaf Center because they make a little more money if you buy it through them. I'm a CPA and my most profitable client has followed and implemented a servant leadership model. That's why they're profitable, sir. Well, it's one reason. I really believe that, and the research shows that. And, you know, something I'll bring up, this is something that I'm really excited about. I just finished testing this model. I had this theory that more other-oriented people at work will make better and more profitable decisions for companies. And my logic for this was this. The more other-oriented you are, the more you think about different perspectives for other people all the time, right? If you have to make a decision and you're not other-oriented, you're just thinking about what's good for me, right? If you're other-oriented, you're thinking, well, how would that impact this person? How would this impact that person? How would this impact that person? My theory was the more you do that, the more that gets you in the habit of looking at problems from different perspectives. And thus, if you're in that habit, you'll make better decisions. So we actually tested this with a company that was starting to do servant leadership. We measured their servant leadership. Does it lead to other orientation? Then we gave them an objective decision-making test to see how good they made. And then we looked at how much money each of these people were bringing on. They were environmental engineering consultants, and the support all the way through. More, you know, the media, basically, things would, there are those who would have you believe that, you know, self-orientation is the best thing for rational decision-making. We find that it's not. Sorry, a tangent. How does a servant leader make sure that the mission aligns with profit? Sometimes I think they're divergent. They can be divergent. The trick is just to, it's to find a way to do both, to find the win-win, right? There are ways to structure and promote your community service, your customer service that are really good for profit and for marketing purposes, right? You're not just doing them for marketing purposes because you don't want your employees to think that it's, you know, you're just all talk and no walk. You don't want, in heightened transparency now, everybody on social media, for them to be poking behind the curtains and find out that you're a hypocrite, anything like that. But look at models like, well, Starbucks at least used to be a really good example of this. Southwest at least used to be a good example of this. Look at models like Zappos. Delta does a pretty good job of this, as much as I don't always enjoy flying them. M&T Bank is an amazing example. How can we, you know, sometimes it's just a matter, like going back to the bank example, sometimes it's just a matter of framing it. Are you talking to your employees? If you ask your employees tomorrow, you know, is our cause noble and worth doing? What would they say? Would they have, yeah, of course it is? Or would they say, no, I don't see that? And sometimes it's just a matter of framing it. So it's a highly context dependent question, right? Some of the engineering companies I work with, they think about it very much in terms of, we are making the world a better place by by giving people new places to live and cleaning up the environment and so on like that. Some of the banks I work with, I've told you how they go with. I work with some agricultural companies, you know, we're feeding the world. In a lot of ways for the servant leader, it's about the mindset and the framing? Do you understand why we're doing this? And also keeping in mind on the other side, by putting my employees first, some people say, well, that's unrealistic. How can a manager put their employees first? Well, if the employee doesn't see the manager and the company putting them first, why would they put the company first? So there's a lot of reciprocation there. We find, sometimes they diverge. More times than people tend to expect, they can really align. My client ties it in with teamwork and accountability, upwards as well as sideways. Absolutely. Does the effectiveness of servant leadership vary with generations? Baby boomers, Gen X, Gen Y, millennials? That's a great question. And actually, I'm doing a research study right now on it. I could tell you my theory, but it's just a theory. It's a guess. We don't know for sure yet. I will tell you that what we find is that there's a much stronger preference for this the younger the group is. So the more recent the generation. If you describe, I did one study actually with the Greenleaf Center where we described 3 really good leaders. And one of them was a servant leader. One of them was just kind of a charismatic visionary, very company focused, not so much, community environment, anything like that. And we found that the younger you were, the more you really preferred that servant leader. So as time's passing, as generations change, as priorities change, we do have some circumstantial evidence that servant leadership is becoming more and more important. And I'll tell you a story. I love stories. I'll tell you a story along these lines. One of the smartest students I ever had, his name was Cole. He graduated back when I was at Georgia Tech. He graduated with his undergrad in finance, and he went straight into a 6-figure job on Wall Street. I mean, he's living the dream, right? He's like 22 years old, got tons of money. 6 months later, he calls me and he says, Jim, I hate it. I'm quitting. I'm joining the Peace Corps. And I'm like, are you crazy? And he's like, no, I don't like the way they treat people. I don't feel like I'm making a good difference in the world. I'm doing it. And now today, he started a firm that offers micro loans to budding entrepreneurs and developing companies. He's not making as much money, but he's never been happier. And I get calls like that. I'm not going to say all the time, but at least once or twice a year from students who go to some big money job. Millennials, Gen Zs, and find, it's not what I'm looking for. I can't keep doing this. So there's definitely some stuff going on there. Let's see. Are there any other questions? I see a lot of chat. Simon Sinek, good stuff. Does a culture of servant leadership have to start with organizational leaders, or is it possible for contributors to drive it from within? There's a little bit of research on there, and I've got some personal experience with it when I used to be in corporate. We think the answer is yes. It is easiest if it starts with organizational leaders, absolutely. In fact, if it starts with the founder, that's why Starbucks had such a strong start with Howard Behar in charge of it. If it starts with the founder, then amazing things can happen. But if they're persistent, if they're consistent, if they are stubborn, it can actually be a trickle-up effect when as leaders see that their employees are being surprisingly effective and they're framing things in different ways. But it's a lot harder to do it that way. Zappos, talked about that. Simon Sinek, seen this training in action, Dollar Tree and Penske. Dollar Tree, I hadn't heard about that one. I'll have to look that up. Thank you. Are we noble in providing service? Thanks. Anything else? I don't know how much time you have. I apologize from over.
The Dollar Tree example, I trained for corporations, their CE work, and I went out to Virginia, and the actual founders, they all eat in the same common cafeteria. Every individual, every executive has to work in a store. They all come up, they all stock shelves, they all wait on customers. Whether he's a CFO or the person right out of the intern, they all have to go through the training so they understand how it works. And it's incredibly important because these people then, as you pointed out, have a feel for the culture that they're building and making sure that they react to the culture. It's a great group of people. And when you go there and work, they don't buy you lunch. You sit next to the CFO as well as the person that's, working in the warehouse. It's a very refreshing way that they do their business model. So
that's a great example. And that story actually ties into one of those 7 hexagons I just showed you, the research-backed dimensions of servant leadership. It's not something people think about, but you've got to be capable of, you've got to understand what the people below you are doing. You can't just be that mountaintop manager that says, go do this, and you don't understand it because then you lose credibility. You don't typically think of that as servant leader, knowing how to run the cash registers, but people react to that. You understand my world.
Well, when Roger Penske comes out to his truck division, he will eat in the cafeteria. He will stand in line. He will not cut ahead. He will sit just as you expressed, like Eisenhower, and he will move around from the tables. And he's one of these very charismatic people that will ask you, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? Very intimidating to have him sitting back at one of my seminars. But he asks good questions, and he's a really remarkable person. And he's another example where he will ask why the door's not opening at 6:30 when people are outside wanting to go to work. I mean, it's amazing. And I won't belabor this topic, but you all know how he works and how successful he is.
Yeah, that's a really great example. It actually reminds me, once I went to Chick-fil-A's campus. I don't know if they have Chick-fil-A in Indiana. I know it's regional, but maybe you've at least heard of it. And they actually have a collection of buildings, and they have a little trolley that goes in between the buildings. It's very pretty. All of the people, all of the employees have a name tag with their first name. No one's got last names. No one's got titles. Now, I'm from New Orleans. So I'm sorry, Colts fans. I'm a Saints fan. I am a New Orleans Saint. Born and bred. I got my autographed Drew Brees jersey. So we hate the Atlanta Falcons, and Chick-fil-A is based in Atlanta, right? So I'm on the trolley, and I start talking about football with this guy sitting across from me, and we just start trash talking each other to the degree, like 20 minutes later, I mean, we're having fun with it, but 20 minutes later, we're both still on the trolley. We both missed our stops. When we finally get off, he introduced himself. Turns out it was the CFO. And he just saw me as a potential customer, as someone who was visiting the campus, wanted me to feel welcome, so he would play with me. There we go. Go Boilers. Yeah, absolutely. I didn't think about that angle. But yeah, it was the same kind of thing. When I walked around Chick-fil-A, you'd see all kinds of people. And another thing, this was a great example of servant leadership, was their cafeteria. They offer free meals to all their employees, their families and friends, 6 days a week, closed on Sundays, breakfast and lunch. The only thing they ask in return, as you walk out, I thought this was such a cool idea. They got this table filled with thank you notes, blank thank you notes. They ask you to fill out one of those, and they mail it to a random employee at a random franchise somewhere all over the world. Sometimes they stick in like a $5 gift card, just so the employees are constantly getting these notes of support from headquarters. So definitely great examples. Would you discuss any tie-in with Hershey Blanchard's situational leadership? There's a couple of different approaches to situational leadership. I'm aware of at least 3 different takes on this. And some of them are very, how can I put this? They're very robotic almost, and some of them are really good. But the one thing that servant leadership adds that I, at least, have never seen discussed in situational leadership is this issue of who are we talking about and who do we prioritize? At least in what I've seen of these different models of situational leadership, I don't see anything about what we call the stakeholder approach, that we are looking at this. And this is the big thing that differentiates servant leadership. I've written papers on this. What differentiates it from all these others is we're not just focused on getting our goals done, getting our things done, making the company more profitable. We're focused on doing that by making the world a little bit of a better place by focusing on customers, employees, and communities. So that's really what distinguishes it. Now, along the way, a lot of the prescriptions with situational leadership are the same. And servant leadership definitely doesn't say you should treat everybody or every context in the exact same manner. So there's definitely similarities. Someone is continuing to grow in my professional career. Are there any thoughts on best practices to incorporate servant leadership and develop opportunities? I will talk your ear off on that. But I would really recommend those 2 books that I showed you earlier, especially the first one, the Greenleaf one, because Greenleaf's a better writer than I am. So there's certainly that. And the Greenleaf Center has some academies and courses like that. But I would go back to, and I'll share the slides, there are 7 very specific leadership competencies that we have developed, that we have identified through peer-reviewed, replicated field research of how it actually works at organizations. And those are the thing, when I'm training, when I'm doing leadership development courses, those are the 7 that I try to focus on as much as I can. And we'll share the slides so you have access to them, but I'll go over them again really briefly. One of them is just what the gentleman was talking about before. It's conceptual skills. You know what the people underneath you do. Like if you needed to take over, you couldn't do it as well as them maybe, but you could do it. You'd understand. You're the first to know if something's going wrong. Number 2, your employees believe that you put them first, that you would prioritize their career above their own, which everybody scores low on that. It's a really high bar. But again, if they don't think you put them first, why would they put you first? One of the ways to do that is number 3, you help them to grow and succeed. You develop them. You're not just giving them the tools they need to succeed in their jobs. You are giving them the tools they need to be successful in life. That's why I love the Allwell example, right? They didn't just train them on home health nursing. They trained them on, you're going to get paid by us. Here's how to manage your checkbook. And they found that when they did that, people reciprocated and actually they stayed on longer, managed their money better. Number 4, you empower employees. That means giving them some autonomy, letting them do things the way they think is best, letting them make mistakes. One of my favorite stories from AT&T, there was a senior manager who, I don't know, do you have messy desks? Like my desk is pretty messy, right? He had to sign a contract. It was a $100,000 sales contract, $100,000 in 1970. Think about what that's worth today. And he just forgot. And it got left on his desk and it got covered with other things. 6 months later, they lost the contract. Because this manager couldn't have taken the time to sign this sheet of paper, AT&T lost $100,000. He goes to his manager's office. He says, here's my resignation letter. I wanted to turn this in before you can fire me. His manager, remember this is Greenleaf Servant Leadership Company, looks him in the eye and says, why would I fire you? I just invested $100,000 in your training and development. And he's like taken back. Wow. Like, are you going to make that mistake again? No, sir. Is your desk clean? Yes, sir. All right. Let's talk about how we can make sure this doesn't happen anywhere else in the company. Yes, sir. We'll do that. That executive turned into the CEO of AT&T. I mean, there's a moral to that story. So empowering people, letting them do things their own way, understanding people are going to make mistakes. Building personal relationships. Would they come to you if something personally was bothering them? Number 6 is just being ethical, fair, and honest. But that's kind of a low bar. Number 7 is, again, the key for servant leadership. It's, are you talking about how what you do creates value for the community? Can your employees draw the lines? Those 7 leadership competencies, and again, they're in the slides. If your employees can do that, if you as a manager can do those 7 things, research says you are going to be more effective from what we see than any of those other 68 approaches to leadership that we've got. Graham, are we out of time, or are there more questions?
Yeah, I think we are good. Jim, I want to say this is one of the best presentations I've seen in quite some time here at Kiwanis. I really appreciate it. And in appreciation, yeah, virtual round of applause here. In appreciation, we're going to be making a donation in your name to Teachers Treasures here in Indianapolis. It's an organization that helps out our teachers with supplies that they need to teach. So again, we're going to be doing that. And I look forward to meeting you at some point. And I have to say, I've got to caveat this with being named president of this organization, but being asked to join the Greenleaf board is one of the highlights of my professional career. So we're really honored to have you today, and again, appreciate your time. We actually had, and I think this is also a really great example of the power of Zoom, right? We have a gentleman from Buffalo, New York, who's able to connect in with us, and we got a lot out of this presentation. So one of the real advantages to Zoom. And we also had 37 people on this call, so a really great contingent of folks. But thank you again, Jim. We appreciate it. And as a reminder, next week, we've got Peter Mancuso, who is the International Vice President of Kiwanis. And I really need your help here. When Peter asked me, I kind of messaged him on LinkedIn to ask him to do this. And he said, yeah, sure. How many people are you going to have on the Zoom call? And I said about 60. So I really need you next week to deliver our Jamaican contingent. I need your help, because if we don't get that, then you may not see me again from a Kiwanis standpoint. To some of you folks, that might be a welcome relief, but if we can get a really good crowd next week, I'd appreciate it. Any other announcements before we adjourn here? Okay, well, everybody be well. Marge, it was great to see you. And Mary, send me that recommendation for a barber, and hope everybody has a wonderful week. Next week, we've got Mike and David who'll do a presentation on architecture and historical preservation. So have a great week, everybody. Stay well.
Graham, great presentation. Bless you. Have a great week. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you for having me.